In 1904, a spiritual revival revolutionised the entire nation of Wales. Hundreds of thousands of people gave their lives to follow Jesus Christ. Drunkards, thieves, gamblers were transformed. Pubs went out of business and courts were void of cases. The power of God was evident in lives everywhere, in the stores, workshops, fields, farms, coal mines and offices. Hotels and brothels closed one after another, and in their place sprung up churches which can still be seen in the Welsh countryside to this day. Healing and changed lives were evident everywhere as the tide of God's Spirit moved across the nation. Two men who had been converted in this revival were brothers Daniel and Jones Williams. One evening, as the two brothers were returning home in the Pennygroves district of South Wales, they found themselves kneeling in a ditch of water, overcome by an awesome presence of God. They were told by the Lord that they were to commence a church to be known as the Apostolic Church. Founded on this revelation from God, the Apostolic Church commenced in Pennygroves, Wales in 1911. They took a stand for divine government in the church as found in Ephesians chapter 4, being that of apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of the ministry. In 1930, Cathcart with his wife and child launched out in faith and migrated to Australia. Over the next 4 years there were some remarkable men such as William Cathcart, brothers John and Isaac Hewitt and Joshua McCabe, who pioneered the Apostolic Church throughout Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne and then along the eastern seaboard of Australia, seeing hundreds of decisions to follow Christ and many outstanding healing miracles. By the end of May 1934, the Bendigo Apostolic Church was established by a number of Christians in this city who had attended a convention in Castlemaine run by Isaac Hewitt and Joshua McCabe. Alfred Ireland and Edward Oldham were appointed as elders in charge until a pastor could be assigned to the Bendigo Church. Meetings were held in the Memorial Hall, Pall Mall, and the church's first pastor was Fred Hurst, who was in Oakley before being transferred to lead the church here in Bendigo. In 1935, Fred was called to go from Bendigo to India to preach the gospel. It's interesting to note that some 73 years later, History Makers Church would become actively involved in rescuing and supporting HIV orphans in Colapar, India. In 1935, Pastor Arthur Robbins came from Adelaide to minister in Bendigo for a few weeks before going to Tasmania to help pioneer the work there. Between 1935 and 1948, a number of people and pastors cared for the Bendigo Church. They included George Dryden from 1935 to 39, Mr. G. Grigg in 1939, Mr. and Mrs. Mackey during the Second World War years from 1939 to 46, and Keith Mappison pastored from 1946 till 1948 until he took up responsibilities at the Apostolic Church in Sydney.
In March 1946, Alan and Daisy Mann, along with their two sons, John and David, felt called by God to go from Bendigo Church to the New Hebrides, or Vanuatu as we know it today, to assist in pioneering the Apostolic Church there. After taking 16 days to sail from Sydney to Port Vila, as they had to sail around the edge of a cyclone, Alan, an engineer by trade, worked on several engineering projects in Port Vila while preaching the gospel throughout the islands of Afate and other neighbouring islands. On September the 19th, 1948, Alan had to travel to Wallaha on the island of Umbai and explain the teachings of the Apostolic Church to the natives of 5 villages. The natives invited Alan back to be their missionary for the remuneration of £10 a month, and on the 22nd of June 1949, Alan and his family moved from Port Vila to Wallaha to establish the Apostolic Church there. A couple of weeks later, Alan had to travel across to the island of Santo for building supplies and was bitten by a malarial mosquito and fell seriously ill. Upon returning home to Wallaha, Alan's condition deteriorated, and on July the 27th, 1949, Alan went home to be with the Lord.
From 1948 to 1957, William Corr pastored the church in Bendigo, and as the church grew, it moved 3 times to facilitate the growth that was occurring. Through the 1950s, the church met in the A&A Hall in View Street, which was located beside the Bendigo Art Gallery before being demolished in the 1970s. The church then moved to the Bendigo YMCA building for a time, and then into a vacant shop opposite the Golden Square Fire Station in High Street, now the current home of the Cheesecake Shop. William Corr left Bendigo to pastor the Burwood Apostolic Church in Melbourne, and his successor would be Pastor Wally Monkhouse. It was under Pastor Wally's leadership that the church took the steps to purchase land and to build a place of worship in Ophir Street, Golden Square. On Anzac Day, April 25, 1959, Mr. Edward Oldham, a founding elder of the Bendigo Church, had the privilege of turning the key of the new church building. Such a large crowd had gathered for the opening that the building was unable to contain all in attendance, and loudspeakers were placed outside for everyone to hear. Pastor Wally Monkhouse continued through to 1964 and was replaced by Pastor Norman Melville. Norman had served on the mission field in Jigalon in Western Australia and Papua New Guinea. Norman would pastor the Bendigo Church for 5 years until Pastor John McNamara came to Bendigo in 1969. John served as pastor from 1969 to 1977, and over this time the church outgrew the Ophir Street building, moving into the old Methodist Church property in Bridge Street, Bendigo. The Bridge Street building was large and could accommodate the growing church. Today that building is known as Bethany Gallery.
In 1977, Pastor John McNamara left to take up responsibilities in our Canberra church, and Pastor Terry Hunter arrived, having served in Perth, Adelaide and Sydney before coming to Bendigo. The church would only spend 2 years in the Bridge Street building, and due to numerical growth, needed to move to a much larger venue. A lease was taken up on an unused warehouse located on Valentine Street, Bendigo. This heritage building is also known as the Fuse Factory, which made explosives for the mining industry back in the 1870s and was purchased by the Apostolic Church in 1982. In 1980, the church changed its name to Ascension Life Centre, and in 1990 shortened the name to Ascension Centre.
Under Terry's leadership, the church continued to grow and a large ministry team was developed. A number of new projects and initiatives and ministries were implemented, which included a radio program, children's and youth ministries called Pilgrims, Eagles, Voyagers and Youth in Action. There were groups for 25 plus, 50 plus and a large men and women's group. The music and the missions department were created, as well as a bookshop and a co-op store. The church also had a number of sporting teams competing in the community, from athletics to cricket to netball and soccer. Over the years, additional properties were purchased, which saw the establishment of the Life Centre House, providing accommodation for young adults, and the commencement of Ascension Life Centre School.
Ascension Life Centre School started in 1982 with 35 primary students. By the following year, the school commenced teaching secondary subjects. However, in 1989, the lease on the Osborne Street campus was no longer available for renewal and a new home would need to be found. The school changed its name to Ascension College and purchased 13 acres of land at Juniton where the school was built. This location is now the current home of the Bendigo Baptist Church. The Bendigo Church would undergo testing times when Terry left the Apostolic Church in 1994 to begin an independent congregation in Bendigo, taking Ascension College with him. This had a significant impact on the congregation, and as a result the church went from being one of the largest churches in our denomination to being a shadow of its former self as a number of people followed Terry. But God's hand was still upon the church, and 6 months later Pastors Bruce and Jan Claridge returned home from spending 2 years at Oral Roberts University in America, where Pastor Bruce obtained his Masters of Theology, to take up the role as senior pastors and to rebuild the church.
Bruce and Jan joined the church in 1978, and in 1980 Bruce was ordained in the church as a pastor. Working closely alongside Terry Hunter, Bruce served in a number of ministry areas as associate pastor, including the school's principal in 1988. Bruce's background as a teacher at Eaglehawk Secondary College and a champion footballer for Golden Square Football Club saw many connections within the local community, one that still continues today, with Bruce being the chaplain of the Bendigo Bombers. In 1994, Bruce and Jan developed a new church culture, establishing the church as a great place for a fresh start. A number of other phrases characterised the church, which included being real and generous.
A number of new initiatives were implemented under the leadership of Pastor Bruce. The church name changed to Victory Christian Centre, which came from Bruce and Jan spending time in Billy Joe Doherty's church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a church that has had significant impact on their lives. Many church departments were re-established and the church began to grow. By 1995, the vision to provide Christian education would see the creation of Victory Christian College. Victory Christian College commenced by renting a property in White Street, Bendigo, and a year later purchased the former Kennington Primary School site on the corner of Condon Street and Marnie Road.
A brilliant decision, as history would record, would be a property that would go on to fund the construction of the current school site in Cairn Road, Strathdale. A fresh focus on the next generation saw Pastor Zoran Pornovich join the ministry team from which History Makers Conference was started, and in the year 2000 a thriving youth ministry was formed. The church would rekindle its link with the nation of Vanuatu, sending teams over on missions trips in the early years of 2000. And by 2006, History Makers Church Port Villa was started under the leadership of Pastor Zebedee. It would prove that Alan Mann had not died in vain, as the Bendigo Church continues to support the work in Vanuatu. In December 2007, Pastor Bruce negotiated a remarkable sale on the church property on behalf of the Apostolic Church Australia with developer Brendan Blake. From this sale saw the purchase of land in Cairn Road, Strathdale, and the vision was set to build a new home for both Victory Christian College and Victory Church.
By mid-2008, Bruce passed the church leadership onto his son, Pastor Nathan Claridge, while he was on to pioneer History Makers College, a Bible college equipping people for the work of the ministry. Under Nathan's leadership, the church undertook a rebrand to History Makers Church, a decision that seemed logical as the church was running History Makers Conference, History Makers College, History Makers Missions, and History Makers Music, who had produced a number of praise and worship CDs. Nathan's passion for mission and justice saw the church focus on local and overseas projects. Such projects included the House of Hope in Kuala Lumpur, India, the establishment of an NGO status in Zambia, Africa, and our community care arm, which includes a food bank and several backyard blitz of local schools, as well as a family affected by Black Saturday fires.
From 2007 to September 2009, under the watchful eye of Bruce Rogers as project manager, saw the construction of the new facilities for Victory Christian College and the administration offices for both the church and school staff. After the church offices and the school relocated to the Cairn Road site in September 2009, construction began on the new home of History Makers Church. Today, the school has grown to around 230 students since its humble beginnings in 1995.
Nathan served as the senior minister for 2 years, and in 2010 Pastors Bruce and Jan served as interim pastors until Pastor Steve Morrison was appointed as the current senior minister. Steve, who has had a long association as a guest speaker at History Makers Youth Conference and national youth events, relocated with his family from Torquay in December 2010. Steve has had the privilege of seeing the completion of the final stages of the building project, a building that now serves the community and glorifies God.
With a large vision in hand, the future looks bright in a new era, including the vision of Victory Christian College providing VCE education in 2014 in a redeveloped facility in Valentine Street.
Since 1934, the Bendigo Church has had a rich heritage of amazing men and women who have served as senior leaders, on ministry teams, in staff positions, and as congregational members to build the church that we have today. Countless people have gone from the Bendigo Church to preach the gospel in other nations and churches around Australia. We give God all the glory for the splendour of His church, and we look forward to continuing to make history.